The Georges Pompidou Center. Built between 1970 and 1977, it's home to books, the arts, and contemporary creation. On the death of General de Gaulle in 1969, Georges Pompidou became the president of France. One of his first decisions was to give Paris a unique cultural center, which would include a modern art museum, a huge public library, a design center, and an institute of contemporary music. 4 great institutions united in the same building in the center of the capital. In 1930, the area known as Beaubourg was cleared of its slum blocks, leaving an 18,000 square meter open space, which in the 60s became a massive car park. It was the ideal spot for Pompidou's project. For the first time in France, an architectural competition was opened to foreign entrants. The 3 renowned architects, Oscar Niemeyer, Jean Prouvé, and Philip Johnson, made up the jury, which would choose from 681 entries. There was everything: a metallic domed roof, lopsided blocks, a high tower. But only one project, number 493, planned to use only half of the space available, leaving the rest as a forecourt. It was the project of 2 young, unknown foreign architects, Richard Rogers, who was English.
When we first saw what the competition was about, we felt that it was probably the wrong competition to do, because it seemed to be a competition for a president, a competition for a monument. And in England, monuments have a very negative, it's a negative word. It's out of scale, has not related to human beings, and we tend to, there's a link really very often to fascism.
And Renzo, who was Italian.
Every time people spoke to us about culture, we felt strange. We felt completely alien to the spirit of the competition and to the atmosphere of what was becoming an important event. Our reply was that of school children poking out their tongues at their examiners.
Poking their tongues out. The project drew criticism which would continue for several years, resulting in a court case. Hurled at the young architects were the same insults suffered by Gustave Eiffel during the building of his tower: oil refinery, hangar, scrap metal, monstrosity, and insult to good taste. This structure, covered in bright-colored metal, literally erupted in the center of Old Paris. The eruption was set off by Archigram, a group of English architects who were school pals of Rogers and Piano. They hadn't built much before, but they were prolific drawers. Their notion of architecture was inspired by offshore oil rigs, NASA launch pads, and science fiction. It was flexible, transformable, mobile, light, and playful. Archigram did not set out to provoke. They just wanted to continue the great British tradition of building with metals. Only in France, where concrete was king. The concrete at the Pompidou Center is underground. It lays 3 stories deep beneath the whole surface area, both center and forecourt. And it contains the car park and soundproofed concert halls. And as for concrete, that's it. Above ground, the structure is really a giant meccano, a huge building set. Take a steel column, then a second. On each column, place a pivoting steel capital called a gerberet. Join the columns with a large crossbeam. The structure is unstable. But attach a metal tie rod from the end of the gerberets to the ground, and the system becomes a stable portico. The force required to hold the beam in place is spread between the poles and the rod, with the gerberet acting as the fulcrum. Repeat the system as often as required to make a building, 6 levels high and 14 porticos long. A single metal framework to keep the building up, a framework that is always visible, inside and out. In order to support the weight of the floors, reinforcements are added to the facades. These reinforcements are X or V-shaped and are fixed between the crossbeams or the ends of the gerberets. To oversee structural engineering points such as balance and the shape of the crossbeams, the architects invited the British engineer Peter Rice onto the project. He would go on to work on the roof of the Kansai Airport in Japan and the exchange module at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. All of the building's facades are in glass, which both reflects and absorbs the city. At certain points, the glass walls disappear, leaving the frame open to the elements, giving the center the look of a building site.
Le Corbusier said that architecture is the play on light on mass. You could argue that the one thing that is changing, and I'm playing with words a little bit, is mass. And I think that the future is going to have less and less mass in that solid term. Bow, of course, is very much more transparent already than most of the buildings of that period. You don't look out of little square windows against mass. Everything is a window, everything is solid, everything is structure. There's no definition, everything intermingles.
The structure of the Pompidou Center is simple and repetitive, but it's been dressed to shock. The architects decided to put all the functional parts, which would normally be inside, on the outside of the building. To the west, facing the forecourt and the city center, they installed walkways for each of the floors, between the facade and the tie rods. And outside the frame, they placed the huge escalator, which transports visitors to the 5th level. These two superimposed layers on the frame of the building give it its somewhat industrial image. Visitors move through a transparent tube resembling a fairground ride. Facing the forecourt is the fair. Facing the street is the factory. The eastern facade is made up of the building entrails, the huge loading elevators, air conditioning, and electric cables. Everything is proudly and playfully displayed. Blue for water, green for air, yellow for electricity, red for transport. The motors for the elevators are contained in these big red boxes. The water from the air conditioning is recuperated by these white mushrooms. Everything is contained within the space between the steel columns and the stabilizing tie rods, where on the opposite side, the architects installed the walkways.
I think we were mistaken calling the Pompidou Center a monument to high tech. Because, in reality, it's a parody of high tech. If it were a spaceship, it would be one designed by Jules Verne. That is to say, one that would never fly. It's one way of stressing the factory image. Factories are the only buildings with nothing gratuitous about them. They're built with the bare necessities.
Like a machine, the center produces. And like a machine, the finished goods are more beautiful than the center itself. The Pompidou machine produces space, naked space. By placing the walkways and functional systems outside, the architects have freed all of the interior space. Each level is an immense empty space, the size of 2 football pitches. 7,500 square meters with no columns, no pipes, no stairs, and no walls. With the exception of fire screens imposed by regulations, which run the whole length of the building on each level, lowered if necessary, from the ceiling to the floor. The only enclosed places, meaning where there are 4 walls and a ceiling, are the toilets and several offices which are actually just porta-cabins, mobile and easily fixed onto metal frames in the ceiling. The absence of interior structure was the perfect answer to Georges Pompidou's challenge: to make a building where totally different cultural forms could coexist peacefully. The permanent collections and temporary exhibitions of the Museum of Modern Art and the Design Center, and the public information library, not to mention the offices of the museums and the center.
To build a monument to culture is difficult enough when you're 50. As a 30-year-old, it's impossible. Richard and I kept asking the same question: what is culture? We never found the answer. All we could do was to build a kind of home, a shelter, and then wait and see.
Both Renzo and I came out from a background of building sheds, and that's because sheds are very flexible. They are what we would call loose fit. You can put anything into it. But basically these are enclosures of space where the activity can be free, or as free as possible from the constraints of solid architecture. That's really what the shed's about.
Rogers and Piano have offered visitors an immense amount of freedom with the absence of walls, and they have redefined what were separate institutions into a greater interdisciplinary whole. They imagined the center as one huge temporary exhibition where partitions could go up and down according to needs. This would allow space to metamorphose into limitless configurations. The visitors, who are as temporary as the exhibitions they view, find they are well accommodated by this notion. As for those whose needs were more permanent, they had to design spaces to accommodate them. In the areas designated for administration, there was a real need for private workspace. Here, 2-meter-high partitions were installed, a compromise between offices and the open-plan philosophy of the center. However, IRCAM, the Institute of Musical Research, needed walls, real soundproofed walls, for both noise and silence. The director, Pierre Boulez, decided to set up home in the building opposite, under a fountain. The Public Information Library, however, took advantage of the extra space and spread out over 3 levels, giving itself more flexibility. In the 15,000 square meters covered by the library, the only walls are the shelves of books. There's no distinction between archives, stocks, and reference, and the daily 1,500 visitors can read or work where they choose. The pleasure of reading is inseparable from the pleasure of walking. The permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art on the top level has a different story. After 10 years, it had suffered as much as it had benefited from being exhibited in open space with natural sunlight. The necessities of an easy-to-follow route, conservation, lighting, and other museological requirements forced the curators to redesign the architecture. The architect of the Orsay Museum, Geo Lenti, was called in to build a museum inside the Pompidou Center. She created a fixed system of corridors and enclosed rooms. Instead of natural sunlight, she reflected lights from false ceilings, which at the same time hid the pipes, cables, and crossbeams. The museum has now hidden itself away in its own custom-made shelter. The Pompidou Center has become more than just a shelter for cultural institutions. It has a life of its own, and it has become one of the city's most easily recognizable landmarks. George Pompidou's dream unleashed a huge monster of 100,000 square meters in the center of the capital. It is almost twice as high as its surrounding buildings. It is on a par with Notre Dame and the Hôtel de Ville. It has 4 facades for visitors to view. It has truly become a monument.
Of course, the Pompidou Center is a monument. We always wanted the opposite. But how can you build a non-monument when you build something that is so huge on a physical and functional level? But we always thought the forecourt was as important as the building. In a city as dense as Paris, we thought it was wrong to use all of the land. It's the forecourt that is the real urban space. It's this empty space that makes the center possible, even necessary. Thanks to the forecourt, the center belongs to the city.
At the time of building, pedestrian spaces in the city center were synonymous with disorder. The forecourt echoes the Italian Renaissance ideal of a city. Like the Piazza del Campo in Siena, it has a gentle slope which entices the passerby slowly down to the entrance. Originally, there was to be no separation between the forecourt and the center. The present ground level was to have been an open space around the supporting columns, but the realities of Parisian weather forced the architects to enclose it in the building. Until 1995, the center point of the center was the Forum, which was used for large artworks and new creations. It has since been filled in, but remains an exhibition space. Art and everyday city life continue to mix right in the main entrance hall. The forecourt introduces the center, and the entrance is a continuation of the city. The forecourt exhibits the life of the city. So too do the facades. The walkways of the western facade are not only a means of freeing interior space, they also reflect the meeting point between the monument and the city. In fact, the whole facade is a public place with its streets and squares. Movement is unrestricted and access is free. The giant escalator guarantees this freedom up to the 5th level, where visitors are treated to the only non-paying panoramic view of Paris in the city center.
No one could say the center is beautiful. They could say it's lively or bright, like a child that doesn't stop moving when its disappointed parents try to photograph it. That's how it is. The building is alive, and today, 20 years on, it's proving it.
The Georges Pompidou Center has surpassed its instigators' wildest dreams. It receives 25,000 people per day and is the most visited building in Paris, far outdoing tourist attractions like the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre. But the building is a victim of its own success and will enter the new millennium with 2 years of renovation. Will it be able to keep its double identity and go on being both a monument to public power and a generous, friendly city within a city?